I remember sitting in a dimly lit room with a woman named Sarah and her dying father, who hadn't spoken in days. Suddenly, his eyes snapped open, but he wasn't looking at us or the monitors. He was staring intently at a completely empty corner of the room, with a look of pure, focused recognition. Sarah whispered that he was just confused from the medication, but I watched his hand slowly reach out into that empty space, as if someone were standing right there. In that moment, most people see a brain losing its grip on reality. We're taught to call it terminal restlessness or simple hallucinations, but after thousands of hours at these bedsides, I've started to notice something that isn't in any medical textbook. This wasn't the frantic reaching of a confused mind. It was a quiet, deliberate interaction. What Sarah saw as a heartbreaking loss of sanity was actually the start of a very specific, organized process that almost every family completely misinterprets. Why does this look so different from standard hospital confusion? When a patient is truly disoriented, they're usually scared, pulling at their sheets. But this is a calm, steady gaze directed at something we simply cannot see. I began documenting these patterns because I realized what we dismiss as the end follows a set of specific cues that tell a much bigger story. If you know what to look for, you'll realize that reaching into empty space isn't a breakdown. It's actually a very natural, almost intentional transition. I looked at Sarah, and I could see the panic rising in her chest as she watched her father's fingers brush against the thin air. She kept checking the IV bag, frantically asking me if the morphine dose was too high, or if he was having a terrifying reaction to the new medication. To her, this looked like the start of a total mental collapse, a sign that the father she loved was finally being swallowed by a cloud of chemical confusion. But here is where the doubt started to creep in for everyone watching in that room. If this were just a drug-induced hallucination, why was he so incredibly calm? Usually, when the brain misfires from medication or organ failure, there is a sense of fear, a frantic searching, or a visible struggle to make sense of the shadows. He wasn't struggling at all. He was nodding, his eyes following something across the room with a precision that didn't match a dying mind. It makes you wonder if we've been looking at the wrong map this entire time. We assume the biological lights are just flickering out, but what if these specific movements are actually a deliberate language we just haven't learned to speak yet? There is a very thin line between a brain that is breaking down and a mind that is seeing something we simply can't. And most families are missing the one clue that changes everything. I watched his breathing change, becoming that rhythmic, heavy sound we often hear near the end. But his face didn't show any sign of distress. Instead, his focus remained locked on that one spot in the corner, his eyes bright and alert, as if he were capturing every detail of a visitor I simply couldn't see. Most families think this is the moment the person leaves us, but it's actually more like they are balancing between two different rooms at the very same time. Then came the movement that always makes the room go silent, the slow, deliberate lift of the arm. It wasn't the jerky, purposeless twitching of a nervous system failing, but a graceful reach, his fingers unfurling as if he were about to take someone's hand. This is the part that feels so unsettling to watch because it looks so incredibly intentional. He wasn't grasping for air or pulling at his gown. He was responding to a presence with a level of calm that shouldn't be possible. Just when we thought he had slipped away into a deep sleep, he whispered a name, so soft it was almost a breath. Yet the recognition in his voice was unmistakable. It makes you stop and wonder, if this is just the brain misfiring, why is the behavior so consistent across so many different patients who have never met? We see the physical decline and the slowing heart, but we often miss the most incredible part of the process happening right in front of our eyes. When Sarah saw her father reaching out like that, her first instinct was to call for more medication. Most families do exactly the same thing because, from the outside, it looks like a glitch in the system. They see the vacant stare and the trembling hand and immediately assume their loved one is trapped in a state of deep, painful confusion. They worry that the brain is essentially short-circuiting, creating a frightening hallucination that needs to be silenced with a higher dose of sedatives. But here's the point where our standard medical logic often fails us. We've been trained to view any departure from our shared reality as an error that needs to be corrected. However, when I look at the monitors and then back at the patient, the data doesn't always match the family's fear. Their heart rate isn't spiking, and their muscles aren't tensed in a fight-or-flight response. What looks like a terrifying loss of control to a grieving daughter is actually something much more orderly. This is the part that almost nobody understands until they've seen it hundreds of times. We assume that if someone is seeing things we can't, they must be suffering or losing their mind. But if you watch closely, you'll see that the patient isn't trying to escape the room. They are being welcomed into another part of it. This isn't the brain failing to function. It's actually a shift in focus that serves a vital purpose. But that's not what's actually happening underneath the surface. If you listen closely, the first thing you'll notice is a change in the rhythm of their breath. It often becomes heavy or sounds like there's a rattle in the throat, which usually sends families into a state of absolute panic. They think their loved one is choking or fighting for air, but the reality is quite different. The body is simply relaxing its control over the muscles we use to swallow. It isn't a sign of distress, but a sign that the physical system is shifting its energy inward. But why does this happen so predictably? Then there's the change in the skin, something we call mottling, where the hands and feet begin to look purple or feel incredibly cold to the touch. To a daughter holding her father's hand, this feels like he's freezing or losing his life prematurely. But inside, the heart is actually making a very intelligent choice to pull all the remaining warmth and blood toward the vital organs that matter most. It's not a breakdown of the circulation, but a very focused prioritization of the core. However, this physical cooling is often just a mask for what's happening in the mind. As the body cools, the level of consciousness begins to drift into a very specific kind of withdrawal that looks like deep sleep but feels much more active. You might try to wake them, hoping for one last conversation, but they seem to be listening to a frequency we can't quite catch. They aren't slipping into a void, they are simply detaching from the external world to focus on the internal one. Most people see this as a loss of the person they know, but if you watch their eyes, you'll realize they haven't left yet. This three-step pattern, the breath, the cooling, and the withdrawal, happens with such consistency that it feels almost like a choreographed exit. We've been conditioned to see these signs as a series of tragic failures, but when you step back, you see an organized biological transition. It's as if the body knows exactly how to let go, even when the mind is still navigating that final stretch. But there's one specific detail in this pattern that almost always catches people off guard, and it's often the most misunderstood part of the entire process. I remember a patient named Arthur, a retired engineer who was always very logical and precise. He was perfectly lucid, discussing his medication, when his gaze suddenly shifted to the foot of his bed. His daughter, sitting right there, froze as she saw his eyes light up with a specific kind of joy that didn't belong in a hospice room. To her, it looked like he was losing his focus, but to me, it looked like he had just recognized an old friend. As the minutes passed, Arthur didn't just stare. He began to have a one-sided conversation, nodding as if listening to a detailed story. His daughter started crying, whispering to me that the confusion was finally taking him away. She immediately wanted to increase his sedation, to stop the rambling, assuming he was trapped in a frightening hallucination. But when I checked his vitals, his heart rate was actually slowing into a peaceful rhythm, the exact opposite of what happens during a clinical delirium. Then came the moment that changed everything for his daughter and left the room in total silence. Arthur reached out, his hand remarkably steady, and clearly whispered, "I didn't think you'd bring the dogs." He had lost his 2 golden retrievers years ago, a detail he hadn't mentioned in days. The look on his daughter's face shifted from terror to a stunned, quiet realization. She wasn't looking at a broken brain anymore. She was witnessing a reunion that defied every medical explanation. This is where our medical perception and the human reality finally collide in a way we can't ignore. We often want to label these moments as terminal agitation because it's easier to medicate a symptom than to sit with a mystery. But Arthur wasn't agitated. He was arriving. What his family initially feared was a tragic mental collapse turned out to be the most comforting part of his entire journey. It's as if the mind knows exactly where it's going, even when we don't. For a long time, we've looked at these final moments and seen nothing but a tragic breakdown of the human machine. We see the vacant stares and the cold hands and assume the person we love is being swallowed by a confusing medical error. But here is the truth that changes how you stand at a bedside. What looks like the lights going out is actually the door opening. This isn't a brain failing to hold on to reality. It's a mind gracefully letting go of one world because it has already recognized the next. It's not a loss of control, but a beautiful, quiet arrival. It's a strange thing to realize that the very behaviors that terrify us are often the ones providing the most comfort to the person experiencing them. We often want to medicate the visions and quiet the whispers because they don't fit into our medical logic, yet those whispers are exactly what take the fear out of the room. Once you see the pattern, the end of life stops being a chaotic cliff and starts feeling like a bridge that has been there all along. And that realization is where the healing truly begins. If you've ever stood by a bed and felt that there was someone else in the room you couldn't see, please share that moment in the comments. We are all learning to understand this final journey together, and your story might be exactly what someone needs to hear to find peace today. You aren't alone in what you saw. Let's keep exploring these mysteries together.